Yeah, Professor Nick Reed of Reed Mobility is going to talk to us about continuing the theme of ethics and looking at autonomous vehicles.
Brilliant. Thanks, Will. Best intro ever. Yes, ethical roads. This is a Rhys Jefferies funded project, Rhys Jefferies Road funded project, which started last year and is just about coming to a conclusion. And yeah, really happy to be able to share some results with you. So I want to first start off by taking the perspective of a time traveller. Imagine I've joined you from 2016. I'll ask you, Brexit must be going hugely successfully. That must be interesting. But no, if I were coming to you from 2016, I'd say, oh wow, how did Lyft, the car-sharing ride-hailing company, get on, scaling to 80% of their drives being delivered by automated vehicles and only 20% by human-driven vehicles? So yeah, that hasn't happened, has it? And you know, in a similar vein, genuine headline from 2016, how is 2023 dealing with the organ shortage that's happened because there are so few crashes because self-driving cars have made all our roads completely safe? Yeah, clearly that hasn't happened. But what that has given us, you know, we're over that kind of hype peak of hype that happened in 2016, 2015. What we can now start to look at is all of the other things, all the regulations, all the technical details, all of the societal acceptance that needs to happen to make automated vehicles genuinely a success. So one of the things I was involved in was some work for the European Commission. They assembled a group of experts. There were ethicists, philosophers, psychologists, sociologists, lawyers, engineers, to talk about what are the ethics of connected and automated vehicles. We weren't just sitting around talking about should the vehicle steer left into a baby or right into a grandma. It was much more about the broader environment in which ethical decisions had to be made. We came up with 20 recommendations, very easy to find. There were 6 on safety, 9 on transparency, and 5 on responsibility. And I was particularly involved in the safety side. And the project that I'm talking about today emanates from our 4th recommendation, which was around the rules of the road and situations in which automated vehicles might choose not to comply with the rules of the road in the interests of optimum safety. So we have rules of the road, not because they achieve safety directly, but they mean that people behave in a more predictable manner, and they encourage safer driving behaviours. For an automated vehicle, you know, you could make it comply to all of the rules, could you? That's an open question, really. But sometimes there are situations in which non-compliance with the rules or non-compliance with the typical behaviours that are observed, which might not always be rule following, are needed to achieve the optimal safety outcomes. And in the expert group, the European Commission, we're thinking about how does an automated vehicle approach this. Now, we could change the rule. We could look to write rules in a way that means automated vehicles could then follow them. But that would mean trying to write enough rules that could cope with all of the complexity that a vehicle might encounter, all that infinite variety. You know, it could be different weather conditions, different traffic, different pedestrians that you encounter on a day-to-day basis. That seems quite difficult. You could, in a challenging situation, hand control back to a driver. That could be a vehicle occupant, or it could be a remote driver, but that seems technically challenging. You know, at the critical moment, asking a human to step in, understand the situation, and then deal with the situation. All of the challenges around that transition of automation to human control to deal with. Or you could allow the automated vehicle not to comply, but it would have to offer a reason. It would have to give you some sort of evidence to show why it chose to do that, why that was the best thing to do to achieve optimum safety. And the example that I use in this situation is something we've probably all seen at some point in our lives. There's an ambulance trying to go from left to right. There is a green automated vehicle waiting at a red light. In the second image, the green automated vehicle has edged over the solid white line across the red light. but it's enabled the ambulance to go past. I saw this actually happen. I wish I had my, I was cycling, I wasn't able to get my camera out to film it, but I saw this actually happen at a junction the other day. Yeah, society, I think, kind of expects this to happen. It's certainly not, it is breaking the law, and you're not expected to. And indeed, emergency vehicle drivers aren't trained to expect people to do this. But it is the kind of thing that we see on a regular basis. What happens for an automated vehicle? It's very difficult for a programmer to sit down and think, right, these are the conditions in which it will be permitted for an automated vehicle to break the rules. And that's what we're interested in, figuring that out. How do we make that determination? And in a follow-up paper, co-authors and I we arrived at this idea of ethical goal functions. So the thought is that automated vehicles are trained using their exposure to the driving environment. So you could train the vehicles. They could see lots of different types of driving, see what is the right things to do, and from that they learn how to drive. But we think you can't expose an automated vehicle to, again, all of that infinite variety of situations that they might encounter in the real world. And even if you could, they wouldn't be learning the ethical principles that humans apply in dealing with the sorts of situation that I've presented. So what they need is some sort of guidance to say, these are the conditions where you might do something different from what the rules would tell you to do. And importantly, that it's not left to the technology developers to come up with those situations, but there is public input into how those ethical goal functions are derived. So what is an ethical goal function? I'm going to speed through this a little bit. It's a mathematical description of the expectations of the queue. So you're trying to gather what society would expect an automated vehicle to do. And it's optimized not only on safety, but critically on safety. And yeah, it's developed with the public, but the regulator has the final say. So moving on to the project, funded by Rhys Jefferies, the person in the picture. The theme of the competition was how would roads be operated in 50 years? And I'm hoping that we will have automated vehicles by that time, but that the process by which their behavior would be governed through these ethical goal functions would have been resolved, perhaps partially, through the delivery of this project. So we had 2 phases to the project. One was a survey, and then through the survey, following the survey, there were detailed workshops to follow up, supported by an advisory panel, and then with the various partners that you see on the screen. Our use case was one of the most common types of automated vehicle that we see in development, an urban bus. So around 15 passenger bus that would operate in the urban environment at relatively low speeds, potentially improving the way people can move around cities. So we had a pilot survey first and then into the main survey. What we were doing, we were measuring people's agreement with a number of statements. So the examples on the screen. If a self-driving vehicle has had to wait a long time to pull out at a junction, it should slowly edge out into traffic to avoid holding up other vehicles behind. Now you could argue it's taking some risk there, but it's doing so to keep to time. And it's helping following drivers not be delayed as well, who might choose to take risks. So there's all sorts of different dynamics at play. So we had 2,000 people respond to the survey, and each of those statements was weighted against particular themes, particular ethical dimensions. So whether it would improve mobility, whether it affected safety of others, whether it was legal, whether it affected the cost of operating and developing the service, people's trust in the service, safety of passengers, and whether it would need improvements to urban design. So let's start looking at some of the results. Now, one of the most consistent response, the statement that had the most consistent response, the most agreement, was on data being shared. So those involved with the Road Safety Investigation Branch, they're very keen, the public are very keen that a self-driving vehicle will share its data, or the operators of those vehicles will share their data in the event of a crash to understand why it happened and what was to blame. Great. Very little disagreement with that statement. But if we move on to others, there was a little less unanimity. For example, asking whether the self-driving vehicle should take more risks to catch up time, that statement I read out earlier. Most people disagreed with that statement, but 28% did show some agreement with that statement, that they felt the vehicle should take more risks. Similarly, we had a statement looking at the safety of the occupants versus other road users. We had around 15% strongly disagreeing with that statement, 14% strongly agreeing. So very difficult to come up with a way in which you would optimize the vehicle based on values of the public when there is so much difference between what people think, how people think vehicles should behave. And just looking at some of the variations across age groups, this was common across lots of different statements. I don't need to talk about it in detail. But you tended to find younger age groups were more positive about automated vehicles and becoming less positive as people were aging. But into the most elderly age group, the line ticks up again. People become more positive, perhaps because they are aware of the benefit to their independent mobility by having access to a self-driving vehicle when they're not able to drive for themselves. So in terms of that weighting of which were the most important values, the one that came up most positively was trust. The one that came up least positively was cost, so the saying that manufacturers of these vehicles shouldn't sacrifice safety in the interests of cost savings. So follow this with workshops. I will fly through these. There were 2 workshops, each with about 15 people, where we went through specific scenarios that kind of were of interest from the survey. So looking at that example of pulling out at a junction, people just didn't want that to happen. Quite straightforward, even to the extent that they wouldn't want it to pull out to help an ambulance. And there was a recognition that driving is all about risk management and that they will probably make mistakes, but if we're learning from them, we're using that data to learn from them, that would be more acceptable. Talking about if the vehicle was crashed into a wall to avoid hitting a pedestrian, none of the passengers are harmed, but what happens to the data? Again, strongly in favour of sharing of that data. This one was around the safety of the occupants versus the safety of the passenger. There was certainly no desire to favour the bus occupants and lots of agreement around treating other road users equally, but being aware that you can improve the outcomes for those vehicle occupants by concentrating on the design of the interior of that vehicle. Skip that last one. And just to say, it's the weighting of those ethical dimensions was, we asked the workshop participants to do that, and if we look at how their rankings compared to the survey, they're mostly the same. Cost definitely at the bottom, trust around the top, safety around the top. But I think all of those top 4 on both sides focus on trust, our trust in how the automated vehicle should operate. So for creating the ethical goal function, it's about how we embed that trust in the way the vehicles would operate. I think that's a good point to finish. The reason for the image on the slide is lots of AV developers will tell you how their vehicles will be much safer because they don't make the mistakes humans do. I would argue that we've had 500 million years of evolution about understanding how we interact with each other that isn't yet programmed into automated vehicles, and I think that's what I'm trying to help them to create. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, yeah, real food for thought there around ethics and what we can learn about human ethics as well from survey results, as well as what we'd need to do to try and predict every possible outcome on the road, which we absolutely can't. Have we got time for questions at all? One question? Yes, Marianne?
Much for a super interesting presentation. So, yeah, the ethical question, super hard. You showed the breakdown on age. Did you also do it on gender? Because we have some numbers in our report that was evaluation of a Norwegian test.
Yes.
We could see that men were all super excited about the vehicle and the performance, whereas all the women were spread out over from didn't like it to liked it.
Yes, we do have that data. I think what we're cautious of is that it's not necessarily a male-female split, but actually it's about technology positivity, and gender is sometimes a proxy for that. So I don't think we have the data to be able to look at that explicitly, but yeah, I think it's probably more a proxy for interest in technology that relates to their positivity about AVs or not.
So you don't recognize that there could be in women that fear of being alone in a autonomous vehicle? Because we also see that women tend to go for the more official people, the drivers, the conductors, ticketing officers, and without anybody to. So
yes. Yeah, definitely. I think it's not. In the panel session earlier, Neil was talking about occupant monitoring. That there needs to be some form of safety support for passenger occupants, whether they're children, but any kind of passengers. There needs to be that kind of monitoring, that safety precautions around their journey, making sure they arrive safely.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks again. Show your appreciation for Nick Reed. So now our penultimate speaker I invite to the stand is Dr. Craig Smith from Agilysys, who's going to continue a theme around ethics, but that's more around international inequalities with access to good data. So over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm Craig, and I'm going to be talking about Global Roads, which was a project to bring together artificial intelligence and satellite imagery to monitor SBIs in countries where data really isn't available. So for some context, going back to 2015 and the launch of the Global Sustainable Development Goals by the UN, there's been a clear progression in policy to put road safety at the forefront of global development. And key to that are the voluntary UN road safety targets, two of which are up on the screen behind me. So Target 4 looks at having 75% of travel happening on roads that meet sufficiently safe technical engineering standards, whilst Target 6 is looking at reducing by half the proportion of vehicles that are travelling over the posted speed limit. But the problem still stands. How are countries going to measure their performance against these targets, particularly in nations where data quality is either incredibly poor or data is just not existent? And it's not just these voluntary targets, but there are a whole host of safety performance indicators that are really important to sort of safe system prioritization of intervention on the road network, and particularly in countries where collision data isn't really readily available and it's not very high quality. So you can look at some examples there. For example, roads that have high speeds, do they have divided carriageways? If you've got a potential of side impacts, do you have vehicles travelling at low enough speeds to prevent that from being a very serious outcome? If you've got high speeds, do you also have sharp bends? And if you've got pedestrians crossing with high enough speeds to kill or seriously injure them, do they have the adequate crossing facilities? So there are lots of really important things that we should be measuring in countries across the globe, but the data really isn't there. So we set out on an R&D project to explore novel data sources for monitoring road safety performance indicators particularly, but just generally road safety data. So this was funded by the Global Road Safety Facility and in partnership with IRAP. The goal wasn't to get small niche data sets that exist in these developing countries, but really to determine what extraction techniques are usable in developing countries, but also globally. So we focused really on low and middle income countries, in particular Kenya and Ethiopia were our two sample countries. But as I say, we were looking for approaches that were applicable globally, which is why our main sources of data, we were aiming for stuff that has nearly uniform global coverage. And we were also looking at data that had already been captured, so we don't want additional data capture, we want existing data. So we looked at Earth observation imagery, not just visual imagery, but multispectral imagery as our primary source of data for this. But we then supplemented that with vehicle level imagery. So we've got Mapillary here, so like Google Street View, but open source, to sort of not just supplement the Earth observation imagery, but also to validate against. And then we paired that with crowdsourced geospatial data, everyone's favorite OpenStreetMap, which is, again, globally available and quite high quality. So the start of the project, we were setting out to initially find out where 75% of travel happens across Kenya and Ethiopia, or just generally a developing country, and also look at what we can determine about vehicle speeds across these road networks. So we started out with Earth observation imagery and detected vehicles across the road network, not just points where vehicles were in the imagery, but their entire footprint, so we could classify based on their size, determine their bearing. So that gives you a count of vehicles across different parts of the road network. But what we did next was really quite innovative. So we looked at multispectral blur in satellite imagery. So essentially the satellites record light across 11 different bands of wavelength. But this isn't done instantaneously. It takes a fraction of a second to record all of these different bandwidths of light, in which time a vehicle can move a small distance. And so we can measure that multispectral blur and get movement from vehicles. So that's a small section of road in Kent there, where the blue blobs are where we think the car has come from, and the red blobs are where we think the car has gone to, which means we can start to measure distances across that fraction of a second, which gives us vehicle speeds. So it's like having speed cameras in space. So yeah, this is the road network we looked at. We tried to cover all major roads and some minor roads in Kenya and Ethiopia, which covers quite a lot of road length. We then went away and procured satellite imagery for all of this, which is quite expensive, but not as expensive as sort of manual data collection, putting down automatic traffic counters across the whole road network. And this is what vehicle speeds look like in Nairobi and Addis Ababa. So as you probably expect, quite a lot of congested roads where you're barely getting speeds above 20 kilometers an hour. But there are some roads that are more free-flowing, particularly this road leaving Addis, which has, very high speeds indeed. So yeah, once we had vehicle speeds and we had these counts from imagery, you know how many vehicles are on a section of road at a static point in time, and you know how fast they're traveling, so you can work out how many will pass through that road in an hour or a day, which gives you traffic flow. So we had maps of traffic flow across the entire Kenyan and Ethiopian road network, but this is where 75% of travel happens. So these are really the priority road networks in these two countries, if you were looking at sort of improving road safety engineering standards. So yeah, we know where 75% of travel happens. We then started to look at what other data sources we could bring in to start monitoring safety performance indicators on this priority network. So there's quite a lot you can get from just network geometry. You can measure bends, not just detect them, but you can classify the severity of them. If it's been digitized, you can use sort of fresh air distances to measure whether there's carriageway separation or not, even if it's not been recorded in OpenStreetMap, which it very rarely is. And we had an algorithm, I don't have a picture, I'm afraid, for determining and classifying junction types using the number of roads entering and leaving the junction, as well as angles of approach. So you can tell the difference between a slip road and a T-junction, or a four-leg intersection and a roundabout. We had a go at determining the exposure of vulnerable road users. So they're not really detectable from space, at least not in the imagery we have available to us. So we're looking at 50 centimeters per pixel, which is enough to pick up a car or a lorry, but not quite a motorcyclist, definitely not a pedestrian, although I'll come on to that in a second. So we used in-vehicle imagery and some standard computer vision techniques to detect pedestrians, pedal cyclists, and motorcyclists, just to give a rough proxy of exposure of these road user groups to the road network. It's by no means a flow model yet, but we're working on doing something that's a little bit more sophisticated in the future. We had a really great land use classification. Oh, running out of time. So we started off with the European Space Agency's World Cover dataset, which is great. And then we enriched that by burning in data from OpenStreetMap. So we took in things like residential areas, commercial areas, schools to add an extra few types of land classification. And then we stripped away carriageways. So this is what the European Space Agency's World Cover dataset looks like. And as you can see, there are very clearly roads there that are classified as built-up areas in red. And that's because roads are grey and built-up areas are grey. So we stripped out roads which tend to be misclassified, but the upshot of that is you actually get land use classifications for either side of the carriageway, which means you can identify the difference between places where you might have a residential area on either side of the road, so you're going to get lots of pedestrians trying to cross, compared to an area where you've got agriculture on one side and residential on the other side, and you're going to get far fewer pedestrians trying to cross that road. And last but certainly not least, road infrastructure, which is where most of our focus is at the moment. So as you'd expect, zebra crossings very visible from above. So we've got a great model that detects zebra crossings. Unfortunately, speed limit signs tend to be very flat when looking from above, so not very detectable. And even if you've got a really high off-nadir angle, resolution isn't good enough to read signage. We're not the US military. We're not able to pick out individual faces from halfway across the galaxy. But fortunately, signage tends to be pointing in the direction of where vehicles are facing. So it's very visible in sort of dash cam footage, the mapillary stuff we were looking at earlier. So you can get speed limit signage for quite a lot of the network, and then in places where you don't have signage, you can infer speed limits from the land use classification I was talking about before, as well as national policy. But in future, we're hoping to develop further. So we're looking at expanding out into doing things like road surface quality, road widths, number of lanes, and the presence and quality of delineation. So this stuff's fairly doable in developing countries where roads are very well sealed, but in Kenya and Ethiopia, a lot of roads tend to be just sort of dirt tracks. So understanding the extent of the road is difficult even for a human being, let alone an AI model. So the project delivered about 1,400 kilometers of attribute data on some sample roads in Kenya and Ethiopia, covering 13 attributes, 3 of which have been AI RAP accredited, plus we provided confidence levels for the remaining so that there can be a prioritization of development in this area. Kenya and Ethiopia got maps of where 75% of travel happened, as well as speeds across their entire network and traffic flows across their entire network. But it's not just that. We've developed a validated approach for determining 75% of travel mapping in pretty much any country on the planet, including those that don't have any other data. And alongside that, we've provided cost estimates in the report on, the cost of procuring data, the cost of servers, the time and effort required to carry this out in country. So yeah, as I said, 3 attributes have been AI RAP accredited: average speed, 85th percentile speed, and traffic flow. For those who don't know, AI RAP is an accreditation scheme for the rapid assessment of roads, so trying to get IRAP data from techniques like AI or machine learning. So yeah, there's a full report on all our data being validated by IRAP, which is available online. And of course, we're looking to validate more of our data going forward. Running out of time, but I really wanted to talk about the limitations. So as I said, Earth observation has some limited granularity, 50 centimeters per pixel. We are looking at ultra-high resolution imagery, which is about 30 centimeters per pixel, which would give us motorcyclists and potentially a rough count of pedestrians. But that's sort of bleeding edge. Earth observation imagery tends to be sun synchronous. This is my biggest caveat. So satellites follow the sun as they go around the Earth, and I've got about a minute left, so I'm going to have to talk really, really quickly. They follow the sun as they go around the Earth, and they take pictures at the time you'd expect to get the best possible imagery, which is great if you're looking at imagery, but it means that all of your imagery is coming from about 10:30 in the morning. So we only really get a real snapshot of one time of day, and then have to use local traffic surveys to model that up. There are obvious issues with mapillary and OpenStreetMap quality, which I won't go into. But despite this, we've got strong results for 7 SPIs that I really don't have time to go through, and making progress towards another 6, plus more we're hoping to add to the list in future. This was Global Roads. This is the countries that we've currently validated in. If you've got any questions, it's probably not time.
Thanks very much, Craig. Speed cameras in space, that's going to be my takeaway from this conference, I think. A fantastic example of a novel data set and squeezing maximum value from it. So that leads us to our... have we got time for questions for Craig? We can take one question. Were there any online questions?
The online question has been answered.
Okay, that's great. Any questions from the room? No, Craig's done a brilliant job of answering all your questions, and I'm sure you'll, like me, be looking forward to seeing the slides in a bit more detail when they're circulated, as all the slides will be in due course. So just last speaker now, we've got Bruce from Agilysys, who's going to bring our focus back onto one of the highest priority areas of the SAFE system, which is focusing on the rural road and understanding a bit more about our rural road network.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Will. And thank you, Craig, for talking in excess of the posted limit in order to finish your presentation on time. A magnificent effort. So I'm going to talk about a project which I would like to begin by acknowledging the RAC Foundation for funding to develop something that's a very important component of the SAFE system, as Will just alluded to, making sure that we don't just look at the heavily trafficked roads, we look holistically at the whole network and understand how we can go about engaging with it. And a big thanks also to my colleagues Craig and Suzanne Coles, who helped with delivering the work on this project. So what we set out to do was to deliver a taxonomy for rural roads. And by a taxonomy, I mean a system of classifying rural roads so that we understand the difference between a rural road and a rural road. Just to put a picture onto that thing there is a rural road, right? That's obviously what rural roads look like, right? I think it's the M40 going through Warwickshire. Obviously as rural as they come, but possibly not quite as rural as this rural road, which is probably the kind of picture that you've got in your head when somebody says rural roads, okay? But in statistical terms, in the way that these things have been set out for, at least 15 years now, they're both rural roads, and they both have exactly the same weight or otherwise, with the result that Stats 19 output divides rural and urban as if this was a very simple binary black and white proposition, yeah? But those two pictures that I just showed clearly indicate that it isn't a binary black and white proposition. There are actually many different shades of grey of rural road between the extreme of the two images, and lumping them all together isn't always a particularly useful way of doing it, not only from the perspective of road safety and creating a safe road system, but also for many other things that highway authorities and other stakeholders have to worry about when they're dealing with their rural road network. So this is what we set out to do. We collected a wide range of data for a randomly chosen sample of rural routes right across Britain, and we applied machine learning to them to identify which of those routes had how many characteristics in common. I'll define in a minute what I mean by characteristics. We then took the output from that machine learning model, so we had a random sample of rural roads, lots of information that we collected about them that was comparable. We used machine learning to group those together, and then we used a human being, thank you Suzanne, to go through and examine our sample qualitatively from an engineer's point of view in order to test how effective the machine learning had been at identifying the characteristics that those roads had in common. And on the basis of both that quantitative and qualitative process, we proposed a taxonomy for rural roads, which I'm going to share with you. Now, some of you in the room and online may have heard my presentation about this last November at the RSGB conference in Harrogate. And this presentation is going to go a bit further. So if you're feeling at this moment this is a bit samey, don't worry, because I'm going to talk about the denouement of the project and where we ended up as a result of this process. So what do I mean by a rural route? Well, we began with the definition that's currently used by the Department for Transport when providing statistics, which is different between England and Wales. We excluded motorways on the basis that they are readily identifiable as a different sort of rural route, and looked at all other rural roads that weren't motorways or AMs, and thought, right, we're going to try and find out what the shades of grey are that exist in these routes. We defined route to be a minimum of 1 kilometre in length, so that we knew we were looking at a sufficiently robust sample, and we weighted our segment by the amount of traffic that they carry rather than the number of miles of them that there is, because of course there's very large amounts of rural unclassified roads that carry very small amounts of traffic, so we thought weighing by traffic would be the most sensible way to weight the sample. The sample size was limited by budget. We made as big as we could within the limits of the generosity of our wonderful sponsors at the RAC Foundation, and we came out with 434 routes weighted by traffic, and that's how they came out when they were randomly selected. So we got a pretty reasonably geographically representative sample of the different roads. Now, of course, we had to collect the information using squares, because we needed to purchase squares of data in order to understand the environment that the roads came through. That's largely where the budgetary restriction came in. So, what information did we use in order to identify what the routes had in common? Basically, there were 3 categories, and some of these things might sound familiar because Craig's talked about some of these things in the context of AI RAP that he was talking about a moment ago. We talked about what's the road physically like, yeah? How wide is it? Does it have a central reservation? What is its sinuosity? That's how wiggly is it in English. We also looked at how people use the road, yeah? So we looked at speed and flow, how much traffic is there, how fast is that traffic moving. We also looked at the environment that the road is in. So we looked at land use of surrounding areas, something that Craig talked about again. We looked at network density, population density, and how far away it was from the nearest major conurbation, because all of these things have an impact on how people use the road. And to some extent, those things represent a proxy for the kind of things that we don't know about these roads, because nobody in the universe has enough money to IRAP them all. Yeah? So we can't go along counting every individual traffic pole. We have to come up with something that is a reasonably accessible proxy for the circumstance that the road is running through. Stats 19 data played no part in this analysis, says the guy who bores for Britain about Stats 19. And there's a reason for that, which I will come back to. So let's have a look at what there were data quality challenges, which I don't have time to talk about in the context of this presentation. However, you do have the opportunity to read all about them at length, because I am happy to announce that our research report was published today and is now available on the RAC Foundation website, from where it can be downloaded. So please potter along and pick up a copy where you can read at length about Craig's struggles with road width. So what output did we get? Well, we got a whole bunch of coloured blobs. We were delighted. This is a violin chart. Each spot on there is a rural route, yeah? And this is taking one measure, peak average speed, out of the 20-odd measures that we put into the model. And that's how the model has grouped roads according to how similar they are in terms of mean average speed. And we had a different one of these blobby diagrams for every single one of the measures that we used, which you can enjoy at length in Appendix B of the report, yeah? Putting all of those things together, when you've got lots and lots of those, you put them together, boil them down to 2 dimensions, and you can then group the dots, remember each dot is a randomly chosen rural route, into a diagram like this that allows you to identify clusters of routes that have a lot in common with each other and more in common with each other than any of the other clusters, yeah? And further group them together into superclusters. So that's where we started. But we're not relying on machine learning. We're not making a black box. It's a means to an end, because the second half of the process involved a qualitative analysis driven by a human being. So we looked at the characteristics that the machine learning thought that those roads had in common. And we then had a majority of the roads eyeballed by an individual examining them and making a human judgment about their properties. Yeah? The question is, does a human being agree with the machine learning, and does the answer appear to be a good fit? 5 minutes? No problem. If he can do it, so can I. So the question was, had we created meaningful, cohesive, collective clusters that actually identified different sorts of rural road? And we also identified some other similarities that were the kind of thing that the machine learning couldn't spot because it didn't have the data to spot it. So this was the output that we produced. There are basically 4 superclusters, for want of a better word, of rural road. Principal roads, country roads, neighbourhood roads, and winding roads. Okay? That one we saw earlier on was a winding road. So we validated that by blind testing. We'd held back some of the roads that had been identified by the machine learning model, and we validated the model, and it worked pretty well. I'm not going to talk any more about that. Let's have a look at some roads. These are principal roads divided into 2 clusters, regional distributors on the right there, and main roads up at the top there. You can see that the presence or absence of a median is a primary consideration there, although it isn't the only one. The second cluster, country roads. This is the most difficult one to separate. We've got primary roads, which is the one in the middle, secondary roads on the right, and tertiary routes on the left. And you can see that there's a decreasing width, a decreasing amount of demarcation and that sort of thing apparent in those roads. There are also other environmental and road user differences between the way that those different sorts of roads are used. This, by the way, is where I'm adding value from the presentation I gave in November about this, because these are the final clusters that we weren't in a position to present as such. Then, supercluster N, neighbourhood roads. So this is places where people actually live or people do things. That, you know, people don't only live and do things in cities, they live and do things all over the place, yeah? And so we've got village high streets, which is the one on the right there, somewhere in Scotland, and residential distributors in the top left there, which in the office we jokingly referred to as, I can't believe it's not urban, yeah? But in terms of the definition, it's not urban because it's in a conurbation that has less than 10,000 people. And at that point, the definition of urban slams the door shut. We've pushed that door open again, we think. And finally, we've got our friends, the winding roads. Country lanes, hill passes, remote roads that might be 50 miles or more from the nearest city, 100 miles in some cases, yeah? So those are the things that people really mean when they talk about rural roads. But because we're trying to define an objective classification, we felt that we could separate them out so we're not getting them mixed up with, you know, those big fast dual carriageways. So the reason we kept Stats 19 out of the original analysis was so that we could use Stats 19 to test how effective this was in terms of identifying different types of road risk between different categories of road. We undertook a collision analysis, the results of which you can read in the wonderful review. Did I mention you can download it from the RAC Foundation website? I'm sure I did. We also conducted a stakeholder consultation in a palace provided by Evo, thank you very much. And we developed a methodology for applying this, because there's no point in having a taxonomy if you don't have a practical way of delivering it, and a practical way of delivering it that does not involve some sort of machine learning black box which nobody is going to be able to understand or engage with. So, on the basis of consultation with a group of expert stakeholders, and thank you very much to everyone, I know some people are online who contributed to that. Thank you very much to everyone who did. We have developed such a thing, and we want to use that to test on a contiguous network. And I'm going to give you now a very quick sneak preview of what that methodology looks like. And at the moment, the easiest way to show you what it looks like is to show you a flowchart that none of you will have time to read and understand. However, you will be able to download this presentation and have a look at it. Will it work? We are fairly confident that this or something like it will be reasonably achievable. But the only way we can be absolutely certain about that is to try and apply it to a large-scale contiguous network. So this doesn't involve machine learning. This is an objective, old-style analytical process which will be mostly quantitative, but with occasional clearly identified and defined qualitative steps. That is our ambition for how it is possible to clarify rural roads in a way that is more meaningful and more helpful to stakeholders and deliver the contribution to the safe system to which Will was alluding. And in principle, in the long term, there's no reason why we couldn't do the same thing with urban roads too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and thanks for sticking to time. I've got a train to catch, and I'm sure other people have, so it's much appreciated. Really useful stuff for linking in with the, especially the roads and roadsides safety performance indicators we've been talking about, but I'm sure myriad other things as well. So that's the last presentation of the conference. Were there any questions for Bruce in the room? Or is everyone just really looking forward to downloading the report from the website, from the RAC website, I believe?
Did I mention it? It's now available.
I think you forgot to mention that, Bruce, so I've just helped you out there. So, yes, on behalf of Road Safety GB, I'm drawing the conference to a close. Firstly, and essentially, I'd like to thank the sponsors, without whom this wouldn't be possible. So that's Geist, Vivacity, Wesker Tech, Unoptic, AccuSensus and C-Sense. So just a big round of applause for them making this possible. I'd like to thank everyone who's come here and joined online. There'd be no conference without delegates, so everyone give yourselves a pat on the back for coming, paying attention and engaging. Thanks everyone for coming. I'd like to thank Agilysys for their excellent, as ever, organisation of the event. It's gone completely smoothly in the room. I'm hoping it's gone smoothly for people joining online. So big round of applause for Agilysys, please. And Agilysys will be delivering 2 webinars on behalf of Road Safety GB in March on the 14th and the 21st of March. So keep an eyes peeled for those. Of course, we can't forget the presenters, so thanks once again to all the presenters. The bar seems to be raised every year, so a round of applause for the presenters, please. And yeah, just my reflections. It's been fantastic. We've learnt about gaps in data and how that links to inequalities and ethical considerations, and how that really relates to the safe system and informing the safe system, because if the safe system only works if it works for everyone, and then we've gone on to the power of linking data and new data sets, but how we can only really get the best out of those through collaborations, partnerships and sharing skills. There's so many new data sets and new ways of looking at the data. We've really got to come together to get the best out of that. Before I draw things to a final close, I just want to check with Dan if I've forgotten anything. No? Okay, well, thank you, everyone. That's conference to a close. Thanks for coming, and hope to see you next year, if not sooner. Thanks, and bye-bye.